Be making your way to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew, the 14th chapter. We're going to read beginning in verse 22. Matthew 14 and verse 22. Matthew 14:22. It says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost!' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.' And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' And he said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" Matthew Skinner wrote in an article about this text, when Peter steps out of his boat, he enters a tumult. His motive isn't to escape from threat, for he goes into a situation where the threat will now look different, into a place where Jesus is defying and reordering the assumed boundaries. I love the Gospels, and I love these stories. It's interesting, though, sometimes that we come up with ideas about them that I'm not sure are actually directed from the text. I've read things about Peter. This was Peter's pride. He's impetuous, and so he wants to show the other disciples that he's kind of premier, and he is going to be the one to go out to Jesus. Or he's impulsive, or he wants to test Jesus to see if Jesus can actually do this. And really, in the text itself, none of this makes any sense. But if we look at the text carefully, I think what we're going to find, and what I want us to see this morning, is that he wants Jesus. In the middle of this storm, in the middle of chaos and crisis, when Peter looks and he realizes who it is out there, that's where he wants to go. And the encouragement for us this morning, where I want us to get, is to understand what's happening here with Peter is the same sort of thing that happens to us in the middle of our faith. As we're trying to live out our faith and journey together as God's people, there are crises. There's chaos. There are problems. There are questions as to why what's happening is what's happening. And the answer, often we go look other places and we talk to other people, look for answers in society. The answer is to look to Jesus, and that's what Peter's doing. Peter, in the middle of this crisis on this boat, in the middle of this lake, the Sea of Galilee, as he's struggling and they're fighting for their life. I mean, these guys are experienced. They know how to be on a boat. And they're afraid in this moment, and they look out and they see Jesus. Peter knows where he wants to be. And I want to talk about that for just a few moments this morning. This is a mid-faith problem for Peter. I know our song, Love Lifted Me, kind of is like a secondary application of this, and it's about the story of Peter, and we see, I was sinking deep in sin, and I want you to know that Peter's not sinking deep in sin here. Peter is sinking deep in faith. I mean, just imagine this moment for a second. I mean, can you imagine how much faith it takes to do what Peter did? I saw this video the other day. It was a wedding, and some of those funny videos that pop up sometimes, and it's the mother of the bride. This is terrible. But, she walks out and she doesn't realize, everything's so smooth, she doesn't realize they're walking over glass and there's the pool there, right? And you know what happens? She walks out and just tanks it right into the pool. Because we don't walk on water. And Peter, a guy who knows how to direct a boat and he knows what water is, he gets over there and he steps out into this raging sea. That is not sin. That's not Peter being someone who doesn't trust. Now, when he gets out there, he has some moments of doubt, and we'll talk about that. But what I love about these stories in the Gospels is, they don't just record stories of the disciples doing great things and never having any problems. They never fall, they never say the wrong thing, they never make mistakes. That's not what the Gospels are at all. That wouldn't be real. And inspired scripture is given to us so we can be encouraged to follow their example, to do the same sorts of things they do. And this is not just the disciples. Think all the way back to the very beginning, the story of Abraham. God calls Abraham, and Abraham then walks in faith and never makes any mistakes. Is that the story we have of Abraham? No, immediately he's lying, he's doing things wrong, and he has to fix all that. And finally, he kind of reaches this pinnacle of faith in Genesis 22 where God calls him to go offer the son of promise. The whole story has been about they're going to have this son of promise, and Abraham and Sarah, they don't see how it's going to happen. They try to come up with their own ways, right? They're worried and anxious about it. And so they come up with their own solutions, which are completely wrong. And then finally, they have the son of promise, and God says, go sacrifice him. And this is this pinnacle of faith for Abraham where he says, okay, whatever you say, Lord, I'm going to go do it. Isn't that just what life is like? Right? We make commitments and we step out in faith, and that's what we're seeing here with Peter. And yet in the midst of that, sometimes there are difficulties. But I want us to analyze this story and look a little bit deeper and think about what's actually happening here and how it's very similar to the things that we go through, right? We claim we believe in Jesus Christ. But God calls us to things that are really hard to understand. Can you understand the resurrection? Or eternal life? You go out to somebody and say, yeah, I believe that one day I'm going to die, and then later on, my dead body is going to come back to life. And then I'm going to go live forever with God. And someone who doesn't know anything about the story is going to look at you like you're crazy. Right now, we're so used to that, we don't think much about it, but I just want us to understand that God is calling us to things that transcend what we understand and know as humans, just like Peter here in this story. He knows you don't walk on water, you sink. And when he goes out in this water, it is through complete trust in Jesus Christ that he is doing this. And so this is a story that's really about chaos, and it's a story about fear and mystery and trust and doubt and grace and undeniable power. That's what this story is really about. And yes, we can make various other applications along the way that may help us, but I want us to realize what the story itself wants us to see. And ultimately, this is a story, first of all, about Jesus' authority. In the entire text, this is how the Gospels work, how any good story works. The text itself leads up to this concept. And so I want to bring you back. We could go further back, but I'm only going to go back to about chapter 12. There is another walking on the water story in Matthew 8. So it's a very similar, but a little different. But in chapter 12, we see these encounters, first of all, with Jesus and the Jewish authorities, right? This Sabbath, and I don't know what your heading says. The heading in my Bible says, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, that's a human written title, but it kind of is a summation of what's going on here. And I just want you to see that this is what's happening in this text. He has authority. He has a power. And that's what's being proven here. He heals this guy with a withered hand. And then the very next thing we see is this connection to Isaiah 42, which is a connection to him being the servant of the Lord. That's the idea. Those servant sections, you're probably most familiar with Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. But you have Isaiah 42 and 49 and 50 and then 52 and 53, which are these four sections about this servant. And just give me 30 seconds to tell you something really cool. In the middle of all of that, there's also the sinful servant, right? So these four sections about this servant who's going to save God's people, just go read that. Go read section 40 through 55, and you'll see there's also the sinful servant, the one who was supposed to do the will of God and didn't, but now needs to be delivered. And so you have this servant who is, of course, a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, who's going to come and deliver these people. And so Jesus is that. Isaiah 42, it's talked about right here in Matthew 12. And as the story continues then, he is this one who comes with the sign of Jonah at the end of Matthew 12. And then the wisdom of Solomon in Matthew 13 as he's beginning to tell these parables and teach these lessons to people that need to hear them. And then you come to chapter 14, we're getting a little closer to the text. And Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, he hears about the fame of Jesus and he knows that he's killed John the Baptist and he's worried he's come back to life, speaking of resurrection. And we have this whole story about Jesus and all the marvelous things he's doing and even authority is hearing about it. He is the true authority. And then he feeds 5,000 people. And one thing I want us to understand is that like Christianity and following God, it's not a mathematical equation, right? Like he's got 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish, and he feeds an entire multitude of people with them. Right? So it's not like we kind of come up with this age of reason in our minds. We feel like we should be able to like figure it all out and have all the answers and know it. Can you imagine the disciples there? He's like, hey, let's feed all these people. And they're looking around like, we can't do this. And that's the lesson, right? He wants them to understand who truly has power. Just like he's Lord of the Sabbath, he is Lord of all creation. And he takes these few pieces of bread and fish and just starts dishing them out to everybody, and their minds are blown. They can't understand what's happening here. Now, just a couple quick notes here. Both of these stories, the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water, if you were here in the earlier session, just notice that both of them start with Jesus going to desolate places and praying and meditating by himself. Kind of interesting. That's important to him. And so he sends the disciples away. He says, hey, you get out of here. I'm going to dismiss this crowd after he feeds them. And they get out on the water. Well, this is where we find the story of Peter. Now, another really cool thing in the text, in Psalm 107, I just want to show you this because it connects to Jesus' authority. He's doing some things here that connect to what's happening in the Old Testament about what God does with his people. So this whole text is great. Read Psalm 107 on your own, but I'm going to point out a couple verses here. In verse 9, it says, for he satisfies the longing soul, and the hungry soul he fills with good things. There is verbal connection between this story and the feeding of the 5,000. Right? They ate and they are satisfied. Right? Drop down a few verses. And I want to prove to you, at least with this one little example, that the Gospels are perfectly arranged in just the way that the authors want them to tell the story the way they want to tell it. A few verses down in verse 29, he made the storm be still and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Now, there's a lot we could do with that, but what I want you to see here is that Jesus is the authority. This is a story about his power, about his undeniable strength over creation. And everything about this story is pointing to this end. He is commanding the things that are happening. He's telling people what to do. He's even in charge of the Sea of Galilee. He is in charge of everything around him. The verbiage of the story, it's a little different than Matthew 8, as I said before, but even the beginning of it, verse 22, immediately he forced, that's the idea of that word there, he forced the disciples to get into the boat. That's important for where we're going to go here in a few minutes. He forces them to get into the boat. And he tells them, take heart. He's the only one that says that in Scripture. And then he utters the divine epithet, I am, ego eimi, I am. Take heart, I am. Do not be afraid. So all the little pieces and parts of the story are pointing to this reality that we need to understand that Jesus has ultimate power. Even the very end of the story, right? They come into the boat. What does it tell us? They worshiped him, saying, you are the Son of God. Now, there's some interesting things in the text that we need to talk about before we get to this next thing I want to mention of what this story is about. It's about Jesus' authority, his power. He utters this phrase, oh, you of little faith. And I love little literary things in text because they help us see connections. But the thing about text is it's hard to know like the tone of voice and how things are being said sometimes. But you notice this is said, if you know the story in Matthew 8, he says the very same thing to them there. Oh, you have little faith. And I do think it's meant to connect these stories. If we were to continue reading into chapter 15, you would encounter the story of the Canaanite woman. And she is meant to be a contrast to the disciples. And he praises her for her great faith. And then a few verses later in chapter 16, again, when he mentions the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and they don't get it, Jesus said, oh, you have little faith again. So often in the Gospels, it's kind of pointing to some of the deficiencies of the disciples as they're growing along the way. And from a reading standpoint, from a literature standpoint, they're what are called round characters. It's not about their body shape or anything. It's just that there's more full story about them. Whereas like this Canaanite woman, she's what's called a flat character. She's in and out of the story. She comes in, there's a story, she comes to Jesus, the problem's solved, and then she's gone and you never see her again. Right? So we're seeing some development what's happening with the disciples. There's more to the story with them. And this woman, she comes in kind of as a contrast. But I want to take cues from the rest of the story, and I think what's happening here with Jesus and Peter is, yes, it's connecting us to what happened before, but Peter has faith, even a little faith. And I don't think this is meant to be some serious condemnation of Peter here in the story. It's just something that kind of connects to the surrounding stories. But what we do see here is that this is a story about Peter's struggle for faith. It's a story that's really meant to help us understand our struggle for faith as well, which is something I highlighted a few minutes ago. And notice here that it says Jesus forced the disciples into the boat. In Matthew 8, it's very clear. It says the disciples followed him. It was of their own volition. They decided they would walk with Jesus and they would get on that boat with them. They followed him into the boat. And there's this raging storm scene where, things are terrible around and they're crying out to Jesus, you need to save us. This is not good. So that's a little bit of a different story. Here he makes them get in the boat. They have no option. So I want us to understand, sometimes we get in situations because of choices that we make. Other times we are in situations because of things that are beyond our control. Jesus commands them, get on this boat and go to the other side. Now he hangs back, and I don't know exactly why he does all this. I think it is for this purpose of his glorification. But there may be other reasons as well why he's going about it this way. The people are wanting to make him a king. He's trying to get his disciples out of here probably because they might have been tempted to do the same sort of thing. So he just gets them out of the way. Then he's going to dismiss the crowd. But either way, what happens here is they get 3 to 4 miles out into the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee is amazing. I don't know if any of y'all have ever been there. I went a few years back. It's just incredible. I pulled into Tiberias, which is on the southern side, and you come in on the interstate, and I remember I was asleep in this van we were in. And we pull up and someone said something about, hey, we're getting close to Galilee. And I woke up and I look and it's just, you would never imagine what it actually looks like. If you just, like when you get your cereal bowl out in the morning, that's what it looks like, the Sea of Galilee. It is this huge bowl that goes down into where the lake is down there. And everything around it, it's like this natural kind of amphitheater, which is why Jesus can get up, on the side of that hill and speak, or he can be out in a boat and he can speak to people and they can all hear him all around. Just an amazing scene. But part of what happens in this sort of natural environment is that storms can whip up extremely fast. So they get out into the middle of the lake and this storm comes up over the mountain, whips down, and now it's just a tremendous raging storm on the sea. These guys know how to row a boat. Done this many, many times. But they are stuck. But I want to mention to you even more about their faith. Because they could have just turned around. Do you realize that? They're rowing into the wind, the text tells us. Tack Chumley says this in his commentary on the book of Matthew. It would have been easier to have turned around and run with the wind, but Jesus had said, go to the other side. And this they were determined to do. The notion that the presence of hazards or difficulties indicates one is outside the will of God are unwarranted here. The disciples were facing rough going precisely because they were obeying Christ. Do you see that in the text? They could have been disobedient and turned around and just gone the other way. Run it back to shore, hop back on and say, Jesus, we know what you said, but it was terrible out there, and we needed to get back to land. They are rowing into the wind. He forces them on the boat first, then they're rowing into the wind. They're trying to get to the other side. They don't really seem to be going anywhere. But it's precisely because they are being obedient that they are in this situation. And so I just want us to understand, I know intellectually we get this, but I want us to see it in the text, that the things we go through, the struggles that we have, the losses that we face, the sorrow that we have at times, it is not because we are terrible sinners and we've done something wrong. That is not always why it happens. Sometimes we face difficulty or persecution or struggle or whatever it might be precisely because we're faithful. How many of you try to live a faithful life and you have family who doesn't like that you do that? This is the sort of situation Peter finds himself in. They've been obedient to the will of God. They're running against the wind. Everything is crazy out on the Sea of Galilee, and then they see this figure walking on the water. Now, they have come from a very different time than we do. I really don't know what we would think. We very much don't believe in like heavenly beings and any of these kinds of things, but they certainly did back then. They probably believed they're about to die. I mean, like, this ghost is coming up. This is what they imagine. There's plenty of stories in antiquity about the idea of, like, you know, before you die, there's some sort of grim reaper, maybe the terminology we would use, especially in the sea. And plenty of people have drowned before in the Sea of Galilee. And now they're seeing this figure walking in the water and they're thinking, this is it. They're afraid. They're crying out in fear. They're saying, this is a ghost. And Jesus speaks up. Peter says, if it's you, call me out on the water and I'll go. And even in the midst of all of that, he steps out. Man, that's some faith. This is Peter's struggle, right? He starts seeing the waves. The wind is coming, whipping around him, and he's getting distracted. And yes, I think we can all see that and understand why that would happen. And he begins to sink, and so he cries out again, Lord, save me. Notice, you know, he doesn't try to get back to the boat. He doesn't cry out to the disciples, hey, send me a life preserver. No, he's crying out to Jesus. And so, yeah, we could be hard on Peter and we could point out, oh, he has some doubts or he's struggling. But I do want us to notice again the direction of where he's headed. Even as he's sinking, he's crying out to the Lord. He knows that he's the answer. And he's just trying to come to Jesus. Look, he's going to go deeper in this storm either way. If he's going to be obedient and he's going to keep rowing into the wind, he knows he's going deeper into the storm. And he sees Jesus and says, I can either go with Jesus or I can save this boat. And I want to go to Jesus. Tell you what, that's some faith. That's him kind of getting out beyond the borders of what he understands as a human being to step out in that water and to try to become like Jesus in that moment, understanding the power and the authority that Jesus has. And yes, as he does that, he does face some fears and doubts. Our faith can be attacked through all manner of difficulties, even as we strive in obedience to do God's will. Maybe it's the death of a parent, or a child, or a grandchild, or a spouse. Maybe it's spiritual, a wayward child, family distress, a broken or a struggling marriage, loss of health, loss of a job. What about the betrayal of a friend? I mean, there's so many ways we can face things in the middle of our faith. As we're trying to journey, we're trying to go to Jesus, we're trying to live this life of faith, miscarriage, failed adoptions, inability to conceive. There's all sorts of things that happen in this life that are hard, and they're not because we've sinned. They can be completely separate from that. Think about Job. I mean, this was the idea of Job's friends, right? He had to have done something wrong. It's called the theology of retribution. Terrible stuff. Just the idea that if we're going through something difficult, it must mean that we've sinned. Now, don't misunderstand me. We can go through some bad stuff because we sin, because we make bad choices, and it brings bad consequences. So I understand that can happen. But what I want us to be encouraged is really what I'm getting at here with the story of Peter, that what's happening here is not that, in this moment at least, that Peter's some terrible sinner who doesn't want to do the will of God, and now he's sinking. That's not the idea. He's actually sinking in the middle of trying to go to Jesus. And I'll tell you what, I'm that way sometimes. And probably you are that way sometimes, where we're trying to go to Jesus. We want to do God's will. And yet in the midst of that, we're in sorrow, or we're in grief, or we're suffering loss, or we have doubts, or we're asking why. And look, the whys in life are like the wind, right? The wind's beating around Peter, and those are all those whys. Why would this happen? And why would that happen? Look, there's an answer to this, and I want you to understand that. There is an answer. God is the answer, and the gospel is the answer. And we look at this moment, Peter here, God, why would you put us out in this boat in the middle of the sea? Why would you let all these things happen? Of course, he has an immediate answer. We have the story right here where Jesus then walks onto the water, and he goes out to Jesus, and we're reading about it this morning. But even bigger than that, it proves the authority of Jesus. And what I want us to understand, when we ask that question, why would God not do anything about evil? God has done things about evil. He started doing things about evil with Abraham. And through the seed of Abraham, he said he would bless all nations of the earth. And so I get the questions, and I'm not saying it's wrong to ask those questions or wonder why bad things can happen in the middle of our faith and while we're struggling. But at the same time, I want us to understand there's an answer to this. God is acting in the world. He has acted in the world. He has set up this whole plan through which the seed of Abraham, through which the Messiah came. And he is the one who's going to make all things right, both us and our relationship to God, but actually the whole creation in Romans chapter 8. He's going to bring everything back to right. That's the end of this. It's not that God's going to leave a completely fallen, destructive mess in the world and say, forget it. No, he has a plan to redeem it all. Go read Romans 8, you'll see. It's just not necessarily on my timetable or yours. Peter's story ought to be relatable to us because it's real. It's raw. He steps out, and maybe in the moment he feels like he's getting burned. He starts to sink. And sometimes we struggle, even in the midst of trying to do the right thing. I do love to see Peter's progress, though. You know, in Luke 5, Jesus says, hey, Peter, put out into the deep. You know, he's been fishing all day, hasn't caught anything. And this is good. It's a good story. Jesus says, you know, put out into the deep again. And he says, Lord, at your word. You know, I don't think it's going to work, but I'll do it. We come to Matthew 14, and he says, hey, call me out. Call me out into the deep. And if it's you, I will come to you. James says, draw near to him, and he will draw near to you, James 4 and verse 8. And so my encouragement to you this morning on this text and this struggle of faith is don't give up. When you feel like you're sinking, that's when you cry out, Lord, save me. It's when you try even harder to reach out for Jesus, because the end of this story is a story about Jesus' abundant grace. I want you to understand this really clearly. Grace is realized where authority and faith meet. That's where we see grace for what it really is. It's where we experience the fullness of grace. It's understood most fully when we understand the authority and the power and the glory of God and our trust in it. And that's what Peter experienced here. He calls out to him on the water as he's failing, as he's sinking, and he knows what's going to happen here. If he's not saved, he's going to go into the water and there's no hope. But he calls out for the Lord, and the Lord reaches out with his hand and picks him up. You know, it's interesting. Jesus didn't have to do that. You know, calls him out on the water and said, hey, Peter, I told you to come to me, and you came out, you started walking on the water. Didn't you see it? Didn't you understand? Have you ever walked on water before, Peter? I mean, come on, really. You should have understood this. And then when you started to sink, hey, that's your own fault. Forget it. I'm done with you, Peter. I gave you all the chances. You should have seen who I am, and yet you still doubted. But that's not the story of the gospel. And I want us to understand these stories within the gospels are the story of the gospel. And in this moment where Peter is struggling, he cries out to the Lord, Lord, save me. He reaches out to him. There's nothing Peter could have done in this moment. And yet Jesus picks him up. They get on the boat, and immediately they're at a safe haven. Because that's what happens when you're in God's hands. It is the nature of faith, humble, active faith, Skinner writes, to be willing to throw oneself into a disorderly world and to expect to encounter Jesus there. It is the nature of faith, even little faith, to want to transcend the normal rules and see what possibilities might be brought into being. It is the nature of faith even to waver from time to time when it has stepped into stressful and unfamiliar terrain. Because as Peter discovered, Jesus is there where the boundaries are being redrawn and extending life-giving stability when the chaos gets the upper hand. Let me break down what Skinner's trying to say here. That when we walk a life of faith, it doesn't mean it's just going to be easy all the time. And there's going to be times we have to step out in faith and we have to do the right thing even when it's hard. And we need to decide we're going to go to Jesus, and we need to trust that Jesus is going to be there for us. We need to have the kind of faith like Peter that says, I'm going to get out on the water because I know who Jesus is. I know he is the Son of God, and I want to go to him. So this morning, what I want to ask us is, what fears are keeping us from coming to Jesus? What is it in our life that's keeping us from realizing we need to step out in faith and come to him like Peter did? Are we worried we're going to fail? Peter failed. Jesus picked him up out of the water. Are we worried what other people are going to say? You know, it's interesting. There's nothing said here in this text about what the other disciples thought. I just think that's kind of fascinating. Like, they were like, no, Peter, don't do it. Don't do it. Like, there's nothing there. He doesn't care. He's going to go out to Jesus. And that's the attitude I've got to have. And that's the attitude you've got to have. We've got to look to Jesus, who is the founder, the author and founder of our faith. We've got to fix our eyes on him. And that's where we see Jesus, where Peter falters a little, right? He begins to take his eyes off. But look, that's the answer. That's where we need to go. Be the kind of people who are willing to step out. Not that we're always going to try to play it safe and not be careful. No, we need to go to Jesus where he is. And through the rest of the week, I want to talk about that. The ability to be courageous and say the sorts of things that Jesus would say. And to believe the sorts of things that Jesus would believe. Who cares what culture says? And at the same time, extend the kind of mercy and grace that Jesus extends to people, even in a story like this, where he doesn't have to. And with humility, understanding that there's going to be times when I'm walking through a storm. And the only thing I have in the middle of that storm is the love of Jesus Christ and his grace and his mercy. And the knowledge and the hope that comes from knowing I can cry out to him and he will lift me up. Is that what you need this morning? To be brought into new life even with Jesus Christ. To give your life to him and realize he's the answer. You can be buried in baptism. You can give up your old man. You can put to death the man of sin, and you can be resurrected in newness of life to walk with him forever, to have the power and the glory of the Son of God on your side. Can we help you do that this morning? Why don't you